The silence hit the dining room table like a dropped hammer. 1 minute, we were a happy family, passing the warm roast chicken and pretending everything was normal. My dad, George, was laughing and my brother, Mark, was telling a boastful story about his great business success. The next minute, my fork was frozen right in front of my face, halfway to my mouth, and the smell of the chicken seemed to disappear. "So, did the money help you out, sweetheart?" Dad George asked, his eyes crinkling up in a warm, kind smile. He looked so proud of himself, like a hero who had just saved the day. I blinked at him. My brain felt fuzzy, like trying to wake up from a deep sleep. "What money?" I asked slowly. I didn't mean to say it like that, so quiet and flat, but I truly didn't understand. For months I had been struggling so badly I thought my whole life was going to snap in half. I knew for a fact that nobody had sent me a single dollar. Across the table, my mom, Carol, reached for her wine glass, but her hand was shaking so much that the glass rattled on the wood. Her eyes were wide and frantic. They jumped from Dad to Mark and then back down to her napkin, which she suddenly found deeply, deeply interesting. Mark, my brother, stopped chewing entirely. He just stared at his plate as if it held the secret to the entire universe, not just a mashed potato. The quiet stretched, growing thick and heavy. I could hear the loud tick-tock of the clock in the hall. My heart started to beat very fast, thumping against my ribs. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. "The money," Dad George repeated, his smile fading into a look of real confusion. "The $75,000 I sent you months ago, Sarah. Didn't your mother tell you?" I just sat there staring. My throat went totally dry. "What money?" Then looked at Mom. I looked at Carol. She was pale as snow, still looking down, gripping that napkin like it was the only thing keeping her steady. She didn't say a single word. That total silence was a scream, louder than anything she could have shouted. In that moment, a massive, sharp piece of ice slammed into my chest. 6 months. For 6 long, miserable months I had been drowning. I worked double shifts at a terrible, low-paying diner job. I sold my old blue sedan just to cover the rent. I skipped meals, just ate plain ramen noodles, and lived in a cold blanket because I couldn't afford to run the heat in my little Denver apartment. And all that time, Dad thought he had saved me. He thought that huge pile of money had arrived and made my life easy again. I leaned forward, trying to keep my voice from trembling, but I couldn't stop the pain from squeezing the words out. "Dad," I whispered. "I never got any money." Dad George's face went white. He turned slowly, his warm eyes turning to chips of cold stone as he stared at Carol. "Linda," he said. His voice was so low it barely sounded like him. "Where did that money go?" Mom Carol's lips parted, but no sound came out. She lifted her hand and the wine glass shook again, finally tipping over. The red wine spilled everywhere, a dark, ugly stain spreading quickly across the white tablecloth. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was the sound of a family shattering. Pause here, and please let me know which country you're watching this from in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you're hooked by this massive secret. To understand why this spilled wine and silence felt like the end of the world, we have to go back 6 months, to a sunny but devastating morning in downtown Denver. I had worked at a big marketing firm for 5 years. I loved my job, I loved the office view, and I felt like I was finally building a real grown-up life. But one Tuesday morning I walked in, and my boss called me into a meeting room that smelled too strongly of cleaning supplies. They told me the company was cutting costs. That was a fancy, cold way of saying, "You're fired." I packed up my desk, smiled a fake, wobbly smile, and told myself the same thing everyone says, "I'll find something new right away." But I didn't. Soon never came. First, I used up my small savings. It disappeared faster than snow in the hot Colorado sun. I updated my resume until the paper was worn thin, sent out application after application, and went to job interviews that always ended with an email saying, "We chose someone else." I started taking random side jobs, anything that paid cash. I walked dogs in the expensive neighborhoods of Denver, I delivered groceries to rich people, and I even spent a few weekends babysitting triplets, which was harder than running a marathon. The worst night was when my landlord, Mr. Henderson, taped a pink notice to my door. It was an eviction threat. I sat on the floor, shaking, trying to calculate how many dog walking hours it would take just to keep a roof over my head. I was terrified. That night I called my mom, Carol. I tried to sound tough, but I was crying by the time I told her about the eviction notice. "Mom, I'm really struggling," I choked out. "I don't know what to do. Can you and Dad possibly help with just 1 month of rent?" Her voice, usually so high and happy, dropped to a soft, worried whisper. It sounded so convincing. "Oh, sweetheart, I wish we could," she sighed. "But things are just so tight right now. Your dad's had some new medical bills and you know how the market is. We just don't have anything extra, honey. You'll manage though. You're strong." I believed her. I truly did. I thought my parents love me and if they could help, they would. That belief, that feeling of love, was the only thing that kept me going during those cold, lonely nights eating cheap ramen. My brother Mark lived a totally different life. Mark was 3 years older than me, and Mom Carol had always treated him like a fragile prince. No matter what happened, when he dropped out of college or when his latest revolutionary business idea failed and left him deep in debt, Mom always found a way to excuse it. She always said he just needed a little push to get started again. Dad George would argue, saying Mark needed to finally stand on his own 2 feet, but Mom never listened. For her, Mark could do no wrong. While I was out selling my car, Mark was suddenly looking very successful. He bragged about his breakthrough business ventures. He wasn't paying for my ramen, that was for sure. He showed up one day driving a brand new massive black Ram truck. It looked huge and shiny and he acted like a king driving it. He and his wife went on a surprise vacation to Florida and posted dozens of photos online, showing off their fancy dinners and sunny beaches. Mom Carol always smiled proudly whenever someone mentioned Mark. "He finally got his business on track," she would say. She made sure everyone heard it. When I saw him, I just assumed he was lucky, or maybe I was just terrible at managing money. I never, not once, thought about the source of his new wealth. Mom used to tell me with a shrug, "Mark has a family to take care of, Sarah. You're single. You'll be fine." I tried to let that mean comment slide, but it always hurt. I just didn't know how deep that unfair favoritism ran. I didn't know that 3 days after my sad, desperate call, Dad George had decided to do something amazing. Dad had called Mom Carol. "Sarah is struggling badly, Carol," he told her. "I'm sending $75,000 to your account right now. It's for her. Tell her it's to pay off her debts and get her back on her feet." I want it to be a complete surprise. Dad George trusted Mom Carol with everything. He never checked the transfers, never asked for a receipt. He just knew he had sent the money and that his daughter was saved. What he didn't know was that Mom Carol immediately saw an opportunity, not to save me but to save Mark. The moment the $75,000 hit her bank account, Mom Carol called Mark. "Your father sent this to help your sister," she told him in a low, conspiratorial voice. "But I think you need it more, Mark. You have a family to support, responsibilities. Sarah is young, she'll find a way." Mark didn't even pretend to feel bad. He agreed right away and took the money, promising he would pay it back someday, when his big business finally worked out. He used it to pay off his old debts, bought that massive black truck and took his wife on that fancy trip. For 6 months, Mom Carol told Dad George, "Sarah is doing so well now." The money helped her settle her bills. And for 6 months I was starving, crying alone, and thinking my parents didn't care enough to spare a single dollar for me. After all that misery, the call came last Thursday. "Hey, sweetheart," Dad George said, his voice full of that beautiful warm energy I missed so much. "How about Sunday dinner? I want us all together. It feels like time for new beginnings." I said yes immediately. I missed him and I wanted to believe that our family could be normal again. On Sunday I walked into the house, and the smell of Mom's roast chicken was strong and wonderful. But Mom Carol looked terrible. She greeted me with a quick, tight hug and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She looked nervous, distracted, and almost afraid. Mark and his wife showed up next. Mark was loud and confident, talking about all his great new ventures and flashing a big, expensive gold watch on his wrist. Dad George was proud, nodding along to Mark's stories about hard work paying off. I sat across from Mom Carol. She kept pouring herself glass after glass of wine. She laughed too hard at Mark's jokes, but every time Dad George said how happy he was that everyone was finally together, her fake smile would get wider, and she would take a huge gulp of wine. She was like a tightly wound spring about to snap. Dinner was small talk and pretend happiness until we were almost finished. I told Dad George the first was still looking for a job but trying to stay hopeful. Mom Carol just mumbled, "You will?" barely making eye contact. Then Dad George leaned over to me smiling proudly and asked the question that changed everything. "So, did the money I sent help you get back on your feet?" The shocking silence, the wide, panicked eyes of Mom Carol, and my flat, confused question, "What money?" All happened exactly as I told you at the start. Dad George was standing up now, his hand shaking slightly as he pulled his phone out of his pocket. His voice was a dangerous, low rumble. "Linda," he said using Mom's full name, "Carol, don't lie to me. I'm not stupid. I have the receipt. He scrolled on the phone, the bright screen lighting up his glasses. He found what he was looking for and turned the screen toward her. Right there, in sharp, horrible clarity, was the proof of my betrayal. $75,000. My name was in the notes, and Mom Carol's account was listed as the receiver. Mom Carol didn't even look at the phone. She just stared at the table, whispering, "Robert, please? It's not what you think." But the truth was written everywhere. It was in the sudden stillness of Mark, who wouldn't look up from his plate. It was in the ugly, spreading stain of the spilled wine. And it was in the cold, clear image of the bank transfer receipt. The receipt that proved my mother and my brother had left me to suffer for 6 months while they spent the money meant to save me. Dad George slowly lowered the phone, his eyes boring into Mom Carol. "You lied to me," he said, his voice quiet, deadly, and full of heartbreaking hurt. "You lied to both of us." The room was waiting for the answer, but the answer was already sitting right there, paid for by my months of misery, the brand new black Ram truck parked in the driveway, and the big gold watch shining on my brother Mark's wrist. I knew it then, my whole family was a lie. The air in the dining room turned icy cold. Dad George's quiet voice, full of hurt, hung over us like a black storm cloud. "You lied to me," he had said to Mom Carol. "You lied to both of us." No one moved. No one dared to make a sound, except for the tiny, quick breaths Mom Carol was taking, staring down at the wine stain on the tablecloth. I looked at Mark, my brother. He was still trying to look anywhere but at me or Dad. His forehead was shiny with sweat. My mind was racing so fast it felt like a tiny bird trapped in a cage. $75,000. That money wasn't just numbers. It was every miserable, hungry night I had spent alone. It was the fear I felt when the eviction notice was on my door. And all that time, Mark was driving around in a fancy new truck and posting sunny photos from Florida. But the worst part wasn't the truck or the vacation. It was the little flash of light that caught my eye. Mark shifted in his seat, trying to look comfortable, and the light from the overhead lamp hit the big, expensive gold watch on his wrist. It looked so heavy, so shiny, and so unbelievably new. For a second I couldn't breathe. That watch. He had bragged about getting it a few months ago, right around the time I was selling my old car. He had called it a reward for his business success. Now it didn't look like a reward. It looked like a price tag. Dad George saw it too. His eyes, which were glued to Mom Carol, suddenly snapped over to Mark's wrist. I watched as his face went from heartbroken to a fury that was cold and totally silent. "That watch," Dad George said, pointing a finger that didn't shake anymore. It was steady and hard. "You bought that right around March, didn't you, Mark?" Mark froze. He opened his mouth but nothing came out, just a quick, nervous gulp of air. He snapped his hand back and tried to hide his wrist under the table, but it was too late. Mom Carol finally looked up, her face full of terror. "Robert, please," she whispered, using Dad's name. "Please don't do this in front of everyone. Then tell me the truth." Dad George's voice was sharp, cutting through her plea. "Did you give Sarah the money or not?" Mom Carol looked down at her plate. Her silence was a huge, solid yes. Dad George pushed his chair away from the table. It scraped loudly on the wooden floor. He stood up, looking down at the two of them, his wife and his son, like they were strangers who had broken into his house. He turned his full, cold attention to Mark. "Did you know about this?" he asked. Mark looked down, fidgeting with his fork like a little kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He didn't answer. "Mark?" Dad George repeated, louder this time. "Answer me." Mark let out a shaky breath that sounded like a sigh of total defeat. He looked at Mom Carol, his eyes silently begging her to swoop in and save him, like she always did. But Mom Carol was stuck, staring at her empty wine glass, frozen in guilt. After what felt like 100 years of awful silence, Mark finally mumbled something. "Mom told me you sent that money," Mark said softly, still not looking at me. "She said you wanted to help me more because I have a family to take care of. She said Sarah would understand that she didn't need it as badly." The words hit me. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a total rejection. My own brother thought I was less important, less needy because I was single. He didn't just steal the money, he stole my worth. My eyes burned with tears, but I refused to let them fall. I stared right at him. "You knew I was struggling," I whispered, my voice sounding weak and tiny. "You knew I couldn't even pay rent." Mark just shook his head. "I thought you'd be fine," he muttered, still avoiding my eyes. "Mom said you'd find another job soon." Dad George slammed his open hand on the table. The glasses rattled and jumped. "You mean to tell me you both decided this behind my back? You took the money I sent for your sister, Decided you were better entitled to it and spent it? Mark tried to sound like he was the good guy. I was going to pay it back, Dad. My business was just in a rough spot. I didn't think it'd blow up like this. Dad George slammed his hand on the table again, even harder. It's not about the money, Mark. It's about the lies. For me, it was about the lies. I thought about all the phone calls I'd made to Mom Carol, crying and scared, begging for help. We wish we could help, honey, but things are tight right now, she had told me. She said that while knowing the $75,000 was sitting in her account, ready to be handed over to Mark, she watched me sell my old car, the car Dad George and I had picked out together when I went to college. She watched me get skinnier from skipping meals. She watched me panic over eviction notices. She didn't flinch. It wasn't just that she loved Mark more, it was that she was okay with me suffering. She chose one child over the other, not because Mark needed it more, he had a history of making bad choices, but because she always had. This time, her favoritism had turned into theft and total destruction of my life. I looked at Mark's wife, who was sitting silently next to him, wide-eyed. Did she know? Did she know that their Florida vacation and his shiny new truck were bought with the money meant to save her sister-in-law from homelessness? She quickly looked away when I met her eyes, which was another loud answer in the awful silence. The whole house, which used to feel so safe and full of love, now felt like a prison built on lies. The beautiful roast chicken now looked like a horrible, mocking thing. I stood up. I didn't mean to, but my legs just pushed my chair back. It didn't scrape, it just fell over with a soft thump. Everyone looked at me. I looked at Mom Carol. I had nothing to say. Words were useless now. I felt like I was looking at a stranger, a cold, empty face that had pretended to be my mother for years. I have to go, I whispered. Dad George stepped forward. His face was full of pain. Sarah, wait. We need to talk about this. I'll get that money back from them, I promise. I shook my head. It's not about the money, Dad, I said, finally using the words he had used moments ago. The money is gone. But so is the family. I walked toward the front door, leaving the fallen chair and the stained table behind me. Sarah. Wait. Mark finally yelled, jumping up from his seat. I didn't stop. Just as I reached the door, Dad George shouted one last thing, not to me but to Mom Carol and Mark, his voice booming with the sound of a man whose world had just been destroyed. You will give her back every single cent. Dad George yelled. And until you do, I want you both out of my house. I pulled the front door open, ready to run into the cold Colorado night and never look back at the people who had betrayed me. But just as I stepped onto the porch, a new sound stopped me in my tracks, a sound that was even more shocking than the quiet confession of the gold watch. I heard a small, high-pitched cry from inside the dining room. It was tiny, scared, and completely unexpected. It was the sound of someone who was not Mark, not Mom, and not Dad. Daddy? What's wrong? It was my brother Mark's little girl, Lily. She was 7 years old, sweet and bright, and I hadn't even noticed her sitting quietly in the corner of the dining room. She had heard everything. I froze with my hand on the doorknob. My heart twisted. How could I leave when the fight had now touched my sweet niece? My escape was blocked by a heartbroken little girl and a terrible choice. Run away from the lies or stay and fight for the little bit of innocence left in the room. I froze on the doorstep. The cold air from outside didn't matter. The sound of little Lily, my 7-year-old niece, crying inside was the only thing that mattered. Daddy? What's wrong? The anger that had been pushing me out the door instantly changed to a sharp, twisting pain of guilt. I couldn't run. This wasn't just my fight anymore. The explosion had hurt an innocent person. I turned slowly and stepped back inside, gently pulling the door shut behind me. Mark, my brother, was completely still. He had been rushing to the door, but when he heard Lily, he stopped dead, his face changing from panic to a look of utter shame. Lily had run from the living room and was standing near her mother, Mark's wife, who quickly knelt down and hugged her tightly. Lily was sobbing into her shirt. Sarah, Dad George said, his voice dropping as he saw me turn back. He looked heartbroken, but a little bit of the fire came back into his eyes when he turned to Mark. Look what you did. You didn't just steal from your sister. You ruined everything. Mark looked at Lily, then back at me. For the first time all night, the arrogance was completely gone. He looked like the little boy who used to hide behind my chair when he was scared. Lily, honey, it's okay, he tried to say, but his voice cracked. I walked over to the table and picked up the chair I had knocked over, setting it down with a quiet clack. The dramatic escape was over. Now it was time for the cold, hard truth. I looked at Mark, ignoring Mom Carol entirely. She was still frozen, looking at the spilled wine as if it was her entire life draining away. Mark, I said. I used his name because I didn't want to call him my brother right now. Tell Lily. Tell her what you spent that money on. Mark's face went even paler. Sarah, stop it. She's just a kid. I was a kid once too, Mark. And I believed Mom when she said we didn't have money. Now I can't even pay my electric bill, but you are driving a truck that costs more than my yearly salary. You said you had a family to care for. Fine. Now let your family hear the truth. Dad George stepped between us, putting a firm hand on Mark's shoulder. Mark, you are going to tell us where the rest of that money is. No. The bank transfer was 6 months ago. Where did the $75,000 go? Mark finally broke. He sat down heavily in his chair, putting his head in his hands. The big gold watch flashed one last time. He mumbled the details. $20,000 went to pay off the debt from his last failed business venture. $15,000 was the down payment for the new black Ram truck. $10,000 was spent on the Florida vacation and business dinners. $5,000 was for the gold watch and some new clothes. He looked up, tears starting to leak from his eyes. There's about $25,000 left, Dad. It's in the business account. I swear I was going to pay Sarah back. You were going to pay me back while watching me struggle for food? I asked, my voice flat and empty. The reality was so simple, so cruel. Dad George didn't shout anymore. He looked at the bank receipt on his phone, then at the stained tablecloth, then at his wife, Carol. It was the look of a man making a life-changing decision. He turned to me. Sarah, Mark is transferring the remaining $25,000 to you tonight. Immediately. And he will sell that truck and that watch to get the rest of the money back to you. I will personally make sure of it. I shook my head. Don't bother, Dad. Keep the truck. Keep the watch. The money isn't the point anymore. The point, I knew, was that my mother had made a choice. She chose to protect her failed son from the consequences of his actions by sacrificing her struggling daughter. The money was just the tool she used. Dad George looked like he had been hit by a wrecking ball. He understood. Then he turned to Mom Carol, whose face was a mask of utter defeat. Carol, he said, his voice quiet but final. You took my trust and you used it to hurt our daughter. I thought we were a team. I thought you cared about both of our children. You let Sarah suffer, and you lied to me every single time I asked how she was doing. Mom Carol finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I did it for Mark. He has a family, Robert. He needed a fresh start. And Sarah deserved to be homeless because she's single? Dad George asked. That is not love, Carol. That is twisted favoritism. I want you to leave. The room went dead silent again. Mark gasped. Robert, you can't be serious. Mom Carol cried, finally looking up. I am serious, Dad George said, his eyes clear and hard. You chose Mark over Sarah and you chose lies over me. You need to leave. I will arrange things with the lawyers next week. We are done. The word lawyers made Mark flinch and it finally hit Mom Carol. This wasn't just a fight. This was the end of her marriage. I watched as Mom Carol slowly stood up, gathering her purse and looking at Dad George one last time, hoping for mercy. She found none. Mark's wife quickly picked up Lily, who was still quietly crying, and rushed out the door with her. Mark followed them, whispering a promise to call Dad George later. The gold watch and the expensive truck were the only things they took with them that truly belonged to me. After the door closed, it was just Dad George and me standing in the ruined dining room, looking at the spilled wine in the overturned chair. Dad George walked over to me. He didn't hug me, he didn't need to. He just looked at me with his kind eyes, which were now full of tears. I am so sorry, Sarah, he whispered. I thought I saved you. I should have checked. It's okay, Dad, I said, finally letting a few tears fall. You sent the money. You did your part. The betrayal wasn't from you. I knew the $75,000 was a massive amount, but the cost of the lies was so much higher. My family was broken. My mother was gone. My relationship with my brother was destroyed forever. I stayed a little longer, helping Dad George clean up the worst of the mess. As I left the Denver house that night, I took the $25,000 Mark had quickly wired to me. It wasn't the full amount and it didn't fix the hole in my heart, but it was enough to pay off my debts and get a small apartment. I never went back to the house where I grew up. Dad George filed for divorce. It was sad and messy, but he stood by me the whole time. He got the house and he made sure I was financially safe. Mark did have to sell the truck and the watch, paying me back the rest of the money over several miserable months. He had lost the support of our father and the respect of his sister. He had his family, but he lost his home. Mom Carol chose her life of lies and favoritism. She was alone now. The money came and went. The truck came and went. But the silence at that dinner table, the moment Dad George asked, "Did the money help you out?" and I replied, "What money?" That moment of total shocking silence would stay with me forever. It was the moment I realized the people I trusted most in the world had built their happiness on my worst despair. But it was also the moment the truth set me free.